Welcome back, students. So to speak, this is going to start our section on comics or sequential visual narratives. We're going to have two assignments at first. One, you're going to have a project to create a comic character, which I'll talk about more at the end of this presentation. There will also be an instruction sheet, assignment sheet that I'll send to everyone. You'll also write a one-page summary and send it to me of the first two chapters of Scott McCloud's Underskinning Comics. There will also be an instruction sheet I'll send to you about that. Comics have ancient origins in the effort to create various kinds of visual narratives. The ancient Aztec Codex, here dating back to the time of the Spanish conquest, was a sort of iconographic index of various gods. But, as you can see, it was much more than merely that. There were also instructions about rituals and narratives having to do with the theology. The Bayeux Tapestry chronicled the conquest of England by the Duke of Normandy in the 1070s. While it is not divided into frames as with modern comics, sections of the tapestry depict individual separate events. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and art also prefigured modern comics in a number of ways, as did late medieval and early Renaissance art about the lives of saints and biblical figures. However, with the invention of modern printmaking techniques, sequential visual narrative became more widespread, as in this series of prints by William Hogarth called A Heartless Progress. This series showed a story of a young woman who arrives in London and becomes a prostitute. In the panels that follow, her situation and station worsens until she dies in the final panels of a venereal disease. Artists, as technology and printing developed further, produced more and more comics, or what would become comics, as in this wordless novel by Franz Mansriel. Max Ernst used drawings and collage in these comics to create absurd and surreal narratives. So we should ask now, what is the difference between comics, which basically are sequential visual narratives of many different kinds of styles, and what we might know as cartoons? Cartoons are a kind of comic or drawing in which the subject matter has been abstracted from a more precise realism or naturalism. Here it's important for us to understand that all drawings are in fact symbols, as in the famous Magritte painting. This is not a pipe. Not really, it's not a pipe. These aren't cows. They're symbols of cows. Now, with various degrees of realism or abstraction, but they are all basically at the heart symbols for cows. In the McCloud text, icons are images that represent persons, places, things, ideas, or pretty much anything. Symbols are a specific type of icon that represents concepts, ideas, or philosophies, as in the examples here. Let's take the example of quote-unquote hobos. Basically, in the 18th century and 19th century, the economy developed particularly around extractive industries and agriculture that needed a lot of migrant labor. At the same time, those migrant laborers were demonized as hobos, and those hobos would create symbols that would actually be warning signs to other migrant laborers about the conditions they could expect when they arrived at a particular town. Here you can see 4 of those hobo signs that would be placed on the edge of a town or a business or building. 1, the sign to prepare to defend yourself. 1, the sign that warns whatever's happening in a particular location is actually a scam. 1 that warns about guard dogs and how many there are. And 1 that warns about hostile people with weapons. So, as McCloud asks, what is the secret of the icon that we call the cartoon? It is basically about the level of abstraction versus realism. And on that spectrum, from one side to the other, what we as viewers are most likely to identify with, and how much information the artist wants to give us. The more realistic an image is, the more specific it is, the more it is a specific person. So take this self-portrait by Rembrandt. This is very clearly Rembrandt more than anyone else on earth. But take this abstraction. The more abstract, the more people it represents. This happy face symbol can represent almost anyone, I reckon, if they smile. Most comics exist somewhere in between these two extremes. This allows the artists and the writers to communicate information about the story, about the specificity of the characters, while still allowing the viewer to read themselves into the characters, to identify more strongly with them. As MacLeod notes, human beings might be self-centered, but we are also empathetic, and we project human qualities onto animals quite easily. This anthropomorphication of animals is something you frequently see in comics and cartoons. This is also something we do with inanimate objects or abstract shapes. This is part of the Gestalt theory concept of closure, that our brain fills in what isn't there. This is not unrelated to how we think of tools as an extension of ourselves. One comic strategy, particularly popular in European and Japanese comic books, is to create relatively more realistic backgrounds and somewhat more abstracted and cartoon-like figures. This allows people to more easily read themselves into the characters, while also being immersed in a more thorough story or environment. It is important to note here that comics often, not always, make heavy use of words, and the written word is also a visual symbol. In some ways, it's the ultimate abstraction, but it still has a visual design element. Alright, for one of your first assignments for the comics section, you are going to create a character, a human being, or an anthropomorphic animal, monster, or anthropomorphic object, like a claw that looks like a person. And you're going to make three different images along the spectrum. One will be in a largely naturalistic / realistic manner, where it looks like a really realistic image. Make one also that'll be in a semi-naturalistic manner, somewhere in the middle, a little bit cartoon-like, but still fairly realistic. And then make one that's very abstracted, very cartoon-like, and so on. Now, I want you to really take your time to think about your character. It could be someone you make up, or it could be one of the literary characters that are going to be on a future slide in a moment. If you pick one of the literary characters, you should have read the text. The text below includes some novellas and some short stories and poems. Nothing too long that's hard to read in terms of time constraints. Think about your character's backstory, where they're from, what they like and dislike, their personal flaws and virtues, what they do for a living, how they are treated by society, by their family, and so on. Each drawing should be 8 by 8 inches in a frame. And you should roughly draw it out with pencil, and then you should ink it with the markers that were provided. If you didn't get the markers that were provided, I hope that you can find some or order some, and so on. So, what should it look like? Well, here's 3 examples I plucked off the internet of Cthulhu, the entity created by H.P. Lovecraft. So on the far right, you see very abstracted Cthulhu. In the middle, something in between, partially cartoonish but still fairly realistic. On the left, realistic. These are like the 3 sort of... these are examples of the 3 points on the spectrum I want you to hit. Here's some examples of previous student work. Take a good look at these. These also exist on that same spectrum. This will also be provided in a separate assignment sheet that will be sent to you. But if you do not want to make up your own character, you can pick one of the characters in the short stories, novellas, or poems listed here. Gregor Samsa in Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, Prince Prospero or The Mysterious Guest in Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, Tessie Hutchinson and Shirley Jackson's short story The Lottery, Victor Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, blah blah. You can read it yourself. I won't read the rest of it. Please check it out. After you decide what character you're going to do, if it's going to be a character of your own invention or a character that you take from this list, you should email me or contact me during the office hours that I will be posting for everybody when I'll be available to talk throughout the week, so we can talk about what that character will look like and go from there.